workshop this afternoon, and I hope maybe one or two of you are here anyway, just to see the lineup of speakers that we've got. So this is an event in a series of sort of discussion events that we've got about the future of organising. It's about how we can move forwards as a labour movement in order to kind of make things stronger, but also to connect more broadly with other activists, with other areas of resistance and movement that exist both within this country, but also more broadly in the global south. So today I'm really, really delighted to welcome three excellent speakers that are going to help us to think about that. But one of the things that I really want to emphasise is that this is a discussion, so we really welcome your contributions and your thoughts on what they're going to present, and also on your own experiences and where you're coming from. So first up we've got Becca Kirkpatrick, who's joined us from Citizens UK. She's a former NHS worker, and now she's an organiser for Citizens UK, but she's also an active UNISON branch chair. And one of the most interesting things about Becca and the perspective that she brings is that she will talk to us a little bit about the approach of Citizens UK, but also the relationship that exists between Citizens UK and UNISON and how that's evolved and established itself. So, Becca, I'll hand over to you in just a second, but I'd also want to welcome Thulsi Narayanasamy. Did I get that right? Yeah, not bad, thank you. He is a Senior Programmes Officer for Sweatshops and Plantations in War on Want. And she's going to be talking a little bit about how organising happens in the Global South. And there is so much organising that happens in the Global South, but very rarely do we really learn the lessons from what's happening there. And I think we could really think about things very differently if we understood more about how that was happening. And then finally we've got Holly Smith, who is an XMA student here, and very, very welcome back. And part of her research was on some syndicalist action that took place at the pop-up union in Brighton. So Becca, I'd like to hand over to you now.
Morning everyone. Morning. I'm very honoured to be back at Ruskin and speaking to you, but also very importantly learning from you all today. So, quick little backstory. I first joined a union when I got an NHS job packing blood products to centre hospitals, and I became a UNISON steward when the management of the blood service wanted to centralise it in 2006. It was the start of a long lesson for me in what doesn't work. For the next 8 years, I was active as an officer in my branch and outside the workplace too. I was one of the editors of Solidarity magazine, and for a short period I was president of Birmingham Trades Council. That was a frustrating time, and it was actually what finally pushed me to look away from the trade union movement for signs of organising success. So I now work for the community organising charity Citizens UK. Their model is a broad-based alliance of civil society institutions that pay dues to fund a very small staff team. Most member organisations are from faith or education, but trade unions are in the mix, and in Birmingham, UNISON put up one of the biggest chunks of money to get Citizens off the ground. Citizens is a UK affiliate to the Industrial Areas Foundation, which was created in 1940 in Chicago by Saul Alinsky. When he got started, he identified the most powerful institutions, the ones that he needed to work with in order to win anything, as being the Catholic Church, the mob, and the unions, which is quite a diverse mixed bag, but with much crossover. Now, Alinsky's organising is essentially a non-partisan method. It lacks an ideology in itself. So it can potentially be applied to a variety of contexts and causes. I'm very clear that I got into this line of work specifically to see how it could benefit the union movement. I'm still very active in UNISON as a branch chair, and now I get paid to work with other branches who are part of Citizens too. So my contribution today will be focused on the pragmatic, but I do like the mix of this panel as Holly's research brings in the ideology in space. And in fact, my own political background is syndicalist, but speaking only of my own experience, I didn't want to stay in a subculture that was satisfied not to be making a real impact. I know there are growing exceptions where syndicalist unions are working hard, and hopefully we'll hear about that from Holly, but that was never my experience. You can read Alinsky's maxims on organising in Rules for Radicals. Maybe some of you already have. His core teaching was that you get as much justice as you have the power to compel. Thinking about power, defined as the ability to act, is absolutely central to community organising. Again, I can only speak of my own experience, but in all those 8 years of union courses and meetings with anarchists and revolutionaries, power was just not on the agenda. The lack of power was visible in every defeat that I was part of, but this never seemed to be reflected on. And I don't think that as modern day trade unionists, we are taught enough about power by our movement. Actually, the book that had the most impact on me was not Rules for Radicals, but Jay McAlevy's Raising Expectations and Raising How, which again you may be familiar with, strongly recommend. So she developed the essential concept of whole worker organising, thinking about workers' relationships outside the workplace. But she also married together that extreme concentration on the idea of power with an ideology, again, a class ideology. So if all change comes about as a result of threat or pressure, working for Citizens UK has taught me to be creative in thinking about this. If you're demonstrating sufficient power, this doesn't have to mean angry conflict. You can be nice in your approach, using that old iron fist in the velvet glove analogy. So in London, Citizens UK just last month brought together 6,000 people at the Copper Box, which is one of the Olympic venues, making demands on housing. And yes, they were giving flowers to the mayoral candidates. And considering my past political background, when I started the job, I did find it quite uncomfortable. But we have to grudgingly admit that the trade union movement is not capable of bringing together that sort of number of people at this point these days. I've got a question here which I'll sort of leave and hanging, and hopefully we'll come back to it in the discussion. But it's fine to make the nice approach if that works. The question then is, if your bluff is called and you don't get what you want, how then can you escalate if you don't perhaps have any further leverage or any way to disrupt? That's just something I'll leave unanswered, and hopefully we'll cover that today. UNISON West Midlands region, where I'm from, Birmingham in the West Midlands, has invested a lot in citizens, and there are so far 3 branches of UNISON in the region who are members in their own right as well. The plan for each of these branches is to develop a team of leaders who will organise and teach others to organise. It doesn't have to be the current elected officers, so this will help with leadership succession and capacity building. At my suggestion, and when I say suggestion I mean pestering, we've also had Jay McAlevy over to train some regional organisers at my own branch. So my own branch is carrying out a regional power structure analysis using Jay's method. This is ahead of the creation of the new West Midlands Combined Authority. We're also starting a branch-wide listing campaign, and once both that and the power structure analysis are complete, we'll be in a position to kick off a campaign which will likely be on care or housing that draws in other actors from outside our branch and in fact outside the trade union as well. I would like to see the union contingent grow within Citizens UK. We have a lot to add to the mix and to gain for ourselves, I believe. So what perhaps are some of the barriers to more unions getting involved in broad-based community organising with Citizens UK? At this point, I'll just tip my hat to Jane Holgate, who's done a lot of research on this question, which hopefully, again, you may have read. Probably one of the most common responses from trade unionists would be, we're doing this already. You know, we invented organising, who are these guys? It's a good point to make. A possible response to that might be, really though? How much are we developing people? Finding leaders, really listening without a predetermined agenda on a regular basis, teaching ordinary people, and by that I mean those who are not political activists, about power and including their own power, and how much are we winning? And I would always pose that question to Citizens UK too. it's not perfect. There's been some very significant wins on many kind of citizenship issues, things like ending child detention for the purpose of immigration, getting hundreds of young people into jobs, securing pledges on housing from Sadiq Khan. Now 2,500 employers accredited as paying a living wage, improving mental health services in several parts of the country, and in Birmingham getting both main parties in the council to agree to resettle 500 refugees. Still, from those wins, there hasn't really been a real vicious out-and-out fight where we've had to really wield power against a very resistant target, so something to bear in mind there. It's fair to say citizens would regularly admit this themselves. There's somewhat a lack of understanding of trade unions in Citizens UK. I'm one of very few staff that has a trade union background. It's a two-way lack of understanding though, because many trade unionists are very ambivalent about faith. I've seen this, and I get it as well. But we should remember the roots of trade unions lie in Methodism, after all. And in community organising, divisive issues, which I'm sure you can imagine what they might be, if they are left at the door for the sake of the broad common good agenda. The iron rule of organising, which trade unions break every single day, is never do for others what they can do for themselves. And since starting this job, I've learned that this quite neatly overlaps with a principle from Catholic social teaching called subsidiarity, which I had no idea about before, so each day with this job I'm learning more. And you will find union members who are more active in their faith community than in their union. I know for a fact living wage organisers in New Zealand are finding that. Sometimes their unions don't like to see that. But by understanding those kind of relationships, Joe McAlevey brought powerful church ministers on board to help win strikes and union campaigns on housing. And even though organised religion is in decline in the UK, especially in cities like London and Birmingham with large newly arrived populations. Sorry, that's not me, by the way.
If you give us a moment, we'll just get these shutters sorted out. So, it sounds like there's somebody trying to respond to you already. The building is quite safe. Are we done? Alright, thanks. Sorry, Becca.
Oh, no problem. So, yeah, especially cities like London and Birmingham and others where there's large newly arrived populations, faith does still matter. In some ways, decline of organised religion maybe parallels the decline of trade unions, and Citizens UK would say this is a problem on both fronts. Another question though that I'll pose and just leave hanging is, others may disagree because the world's changing rapidly and perhaps some old structures are being overtaken by others, so that's a debate that's very live. Thulsi is bringing the global perspective today with that tight focus on the priority of ending urgent want, and this spurs me on every day. Because in 2016, there should be no place anywhere on the planet for hunger and lack of basic amenities. Alinsky said, break problems into issues, which by that he meant take the huge things, slice them down into small, achievable things that you can gradually win and build up a sense of success. I still feel there's kind of an urgency now though, with rising poverty, escalating conflict, environmental destruction. We could have a never-ending shopping list of wants. So the last quote from Alinsky that I'll use today is, power precedes programme. As in, you build the relationships first, you build as powerful alliance as possible first, and then you choose what it is you'll demand based on the amount of power that you've amassed. So if we accept that, then it's not about marches to build confidence, and it's not even about winning the argument. We can clearly see that all of the money and resources that we need to meet everyone's basic needs is available, or should I say exists, resting in Swiss bank accounts and shares in Panama. So we simply need to get on with systematically building the power that it takes to compel that our needs are met. And I believe that this is a bigger job than we as a union movement can manage on our own.
Thank you very much, Becca. I think that's a really good way to kick off the discussion here. And what I want to do now is ask Thulsi to add to that an international perspective from her work with War on Want. Now, Thulsi is mainly going to be talking about garment workers, which is one of the examples that I think we know the best in this country, certainly from the recent terrible disasters around plazas and so on. But I think also it does contain quite a lot of material for us to really think about in terms of broader industries and broader ways of organising. So Thulsi, thank you very much for being here.
Hello everyone, lovely to be here. I've just arrived from Australia not so long ago, and walking here I felt like Elizabeth Bennet actually. I feel like that most days actually in the UK. Thanks for that introduction. So I work with War on Want as the sweatshops and plantations person. My focus is predominantly in Asia, so kind of China, South Asia, and then Southeast Asia. So I'm not sure how much people kind of know about War on Want. Can I just kind of get a show of hands? Do people know War on Want? Is that like War on Want? Oh, yeah. Wow. I'm new. Great. I will spare you the waffling introduction that you could probably give better than me. But, suffice to say, War on Want has had this really long-standing relationship with the trade union movement in the UK as well as overseas, and a lot of our work done overseas is focused really firmly on that. I mean, that said, our work could kind of be kind of mapped thematically also. So we have a focus on broadly on corporate impunity, I suppose, and on the kind of structural causes of poverty and disadvantage. So, I mean, what this kind of means in terms of the way that we think about our work internally is that we have a lot of discussions that are focused around the patriarchy and white supremacy and these kinds of things that I think do set us apart in a lot of ways from kind of NGOs or maybe trade unions. And I think in large part that's because we do the best we can, I suppose, to take direction for our work and our thinking from our partners in the Global South. So our partners are quite broad-ranging. I'll mainly be speaking, as Finola said, around garment workers. But we do have kind of traditional trade union partners that are affiliated with the GUFs, and then we also have kind of women's groups and kind of social movements then who, I don't really know how you'd want to define them. But I think, before I kind of launch into anything, I think it's really important to kind of note the difference, I suppose, between the role of traditional trade unions in places like the UK and the role that they play in the Global South, which I think is much larger. I think the need for that kind of collective engagement is very different, and I think is a lot more responsive and agile in the Global South than it is in the UK. I should also preface it, now that you've told me that you're recording me, that everything I'm about to say is my own opinion and does not represent the opinion of War on Want. I love trade unions. Okay. Thanks for that. Great. I guess, in my experience, trade unions are massively lagging behind. And in a lot of ways, I think we're at a stage where we need to consider to what extent they're helping or hindering kind of achievement of goals of broad inequality. It's been really interesting for me to kind of walk into a kind of new area for me, in that working with trade unions is new for me, I must say. So it's been very interesting, for example, in the context of Bangladesh, where we have a fantastic trade union partner and work with some of the GUFs and a Danish union, 3F, over there as well. Just to see the way that it operates, and I suppose, if I had to sum it up in one word, two words, it would be just like a bureaucratic behemoth. Like, it's just extraordinary the amount of effort it takes in order for change to happen, and where the power lies, unfortunately, is at the top. Like, I am very dismayed, I suppose, by how little democracy there seems to be within the trade union movement, and how inherently and dangerously patriarchal they are. So with the work that I do with garment workers, most workers, over 85% of workers are women, and yet the trade union movement representing these women is largely led by men. I mean, to me, that's the equivalent of saying that there's a feminist movement led by men, or a black rights movement led by white people. Like, it's completely extraordinary, and I think to a really large degree, I think we've just normalised it and apologised for it, when I think we're not really going to change it until we accept that it's a problem in and of itself. A lot of the work that we do in Bangladesh, for example, does have a focus on empowering women, which is really important. I think these discussions are definitely happening within the traditional trade union movement, but that's it. That's exactly all it is. It's discussions and it's trainings, but ultimately, if you're a young woman who's a garment worker, and you walk into a training that's run by men about how you're going to be empowered by a union that's entirely run by men, I think your imagination is necessarily going to be quite limited then in terms of what it is that you can achieve. By contrast, I suppose, there are groups that are entirely run by women that I would argue play the role of women, insofar as I don't think you can separate labour rights from women's rights, particularly when you've got predominantly female workers. I think without an analysis of the power structures that put you in a situation of disadvantage in the workplace, you need to be broadly kind of accepting what women's role in society is, and how that's marginalised both in and out of the workplace. And this is what these groups do. But very unfortunately, it's of my opinion that they're really marginalised by the traditional trade union movement and structures. So to give you an example, we work with some fantastic groups in Honduras. Podemu is our partner, which is basically, I'm just trying to think of what the acronym is, but then I realised it's in Spanish. Yes, I was just going to start speaking in Spanish. So yeah, they're basically like a collective of maquila, of women garment workers in Honduras, and they're part of a broader kind of collective of women's organisations across that Central American region. Brilliant, love them. And they have this really difficult time, despite the fact that they've made extraordinary leaps in terms of fighting for those traditional kind of rights that the trade unions go for in terms of wages and hours and these sorts of things. But in doing that, they're also in a position where they're having to fight for recognition as a union. Because they're framing their issues as women's issues rather than labour issues, they really struggle for recognition, and they struggle for what that translates to, which is funding, which is really difficult. You've then got what I would consider one of the most successful movements towards labour rights in that region, that's run by women for women, that's having to let staff go kind of every other month because they just don't have the funding that some of the big guffs have. And it's been a really funny week for me. I've been trying to kind of get funding for these women. And every single person I've spoken to, and I won't say which trade unions, have been saying, they are really good, and we're aware of their effectiveness, but if you're going to get money for them, you need to commit to pushing them to partner with the traditional trade union. So I think, to me, that is heartbreaking and really insidious in terms of undermining the role that those women play. And that's just one example of so many. I've come across that in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, in China, and it's, I think it speaks to the unsteadiness, I think, and the insecurity of the trade union movement more broadly, in struggling to make itself relevant in a lot of ways. I think we certainly can't discount the gains and the importance of trade unions. I think a lot of the language that we use of solidarity and around rights has largely come from the trade union movement, which is so important. It's obviously, but I don't think that means that we can't respond to what is happening now in the world. And I kind of see this is the situations happening with workers, and this is where trade unions are. And that gap, I feel, is ever widening at the moment. I think a big part of that, particularly when looking at the relationship between the trade union movements, sort of in the UK or the international federations and the global south, is a gap of experience, of lived experience, I suppose. You know, the situation facing women workers or garment workers in Bangladesh is not just one, for example, of what they're facing in the workplace. It's their entire lives. It was shaped from when they were young in terms of what kind of access they would have to education, to work, you know, and that, you know, that necessarily kind of permeates all of their needs, really, their experiences as women. And it's not just something that we can break up into saying, oh, trade unions should respond to women having their periods in the workplace, women who are pregnant, women going through menopause, or sexual harassment or whatever, when in so many cases those same kind of power structures are embedded within the trade unions in these countries. I mean, my experience of walking into some of the trade unions in the global south with, you know, masses and masses of men, and me, small brown woman who looks like I'm about 15, it's just been, you know, horrifying in terms of how intimidated I feel. And you know, this is me with my Western education and background and general rantiness, and I don't know how these women do it. Like, they're extraordinary to still kind of feel the need to, or see the capacity of trade unions to create that change enough so that they will kind of embed themselves within those structures. An example I wanted to use, I have no idea how long I'm going to sit. Will you just tell me to shut up when you tell me?
Yes, cool. Another 5 minutes, so
Give me a platform. An example I wanted to give here, which is the reason for my big caveat, is, you know, in order to kind of demonstrate, I guess, the fact that the trade union movement hasn't really thought about the drivers of working conditions in terms of corporate impunity or patriarchy and all of these things, would be the TUC and the Ethical Trading Initiative. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the ETI, but I know this is going to sound like it's not related, but I promise eventually it will be. So the ETI is basically an initiative of the TUC as well as kind of governments and all of the big fashion brands, M&S, Primark, blah, blah, blah. They're all kind of part of this initiative, and the reason why the TUC and the trade union movement decided to get involved in this was because they thought they could push for labour rights, basically, within this structure, which is very nice and very naive. And so basically what this now looks like is all of these brands are now part of this ethical trading initiative, regardless of what they do or how they behave for their workers in their workplace. They now have this stamp of approval, basically, from the trade union movement. They have no way to monitor what the experience of workers is on the ground. They are not there to push for union representation in factories. They are just there to sort of broadly sit around and have discussions about, you know, maybe trying to think a little bit more about, you know, maybe having maybe representation in factories. That just sounds a little bit naive, which potentially in and of itself wouldn't be that harmful, but the way that it's played out, particularly in the global south, whose workers, I would argue, have been disproportionately affected by the fact that trade unions have decided to associate themselves with these kinds of power structures because they have access to it, has meant that, for example, in Honduras, there have been some really serious, horrible union-busting activities that have happened with banana workers and fruit pickers in Honduras, and the Fifes, the company that is an associate of the ETI, were the ones that were responsible for this, right? Like bashing trade union, really, really horrible stuff that we see all the time conducted by corporations like this. And unfortunately, when the workers then, in the grassroots movement, as usually happens, rose up in order to confront Fifes and build kind of connections of international solidarity, that was shut down. by the ETI, who said, no, we've got our own internal processes, we're not going to support you to speak out against fives. And to me, that is just mind-blowing, that we've gotten to a situation where in the global north, like the TUC with all of the power and money that they have, are in a position where largely they're legitimising union busting in the global south. And I think that there is a real crisis when we're not in a position to be able to talk openly about this, when clearly it's just doing what we ought to be doing, which is representing the needs of workers. The fact that I feel a little bit nervous about coming out and saying that is horrifying. I mean, like, we should be able to freely speak on behalf of the workers and workers' experiences and the hindrances to that. And the fact that there's such nervousness for calling out an institution is phenomenal. I mean, where else do you see that? You see that with like religious institutions and the idea of blasphemy. Like, I didn't realise that there was blasphemy that could be applied to the bloody trade union movement. Anyway, but you know, I've got a lot more examples like that. I feel like I've been rambling on for a really long time, and maybe it would be better done in discussions if you have actual questions for me. But I feel like I had another really good example. Yeah, so in China... One more minute. In China, for example, I think, I guess we're about to put out a report about this, PS, I had to do a plug. But where there is such institutionalised repression of trade unions, I think it's probably a really good place for people to look if they are interested in terms of labour rights being fought through a grassroots movement. In the absence of trade unions, there has been extraordinary leaps forward in terms of labour rights. Wages are higher than they are in any other part of Asia. You know, there are many leaps taken towards attaining labour rights and women's rights both within and outside of the workplace within China. And we never talk about it, and we never hear about it because it's not associated with the traditional trade union movement. I think we just like to talk about how repressed they are, when I guess my experience has been in China that it's quite the opposite, and that the unions are playing an incredible role of supporting the mostly internal migrant workers who work in the factories, inside factories to kind of create like the process of awareness, because it is a process and it kind of, you can just have a trade union and it happens. And they just do really interesting things, like rather than kind of just having a training, they have a day of hiking, and kind of, you know, through that day, like, and having those kind of connections with other women and sharing experiences, they then are able to kind of intersperse that with being able to kind of educate and speak to women about their rights. And I think these kinds of things are really obscured, almost intentionally, I think, sometimes by the trade union movement. But I think we have a great deal to learn in terms of how organising happens in the global south, and it's my hope that in the future there will be a little bit more scope for that. Thank you very much.
Very much, it's brilliant. I'm going to leave all questions and things to the end, because then I'd like it to kick off into a broader discussion, so just hang on to anything that you want to ask Thulsi, but I'm sure we will come back to all these other examples that you tempt us with. So, last but by no means least is our friend and comrade Holly, who did some really interesting research while she was here at Ruskin, and I think that that's in some ways, I think it's been one of the most forward-looking pieces of research that we've been lucky enough to have here. So Holly's going to talk about some of that. And afterwards, what I'd like is, because just to take advantage of the presence of Paul Stewart and Tommy McCartney here from the Independent Workers' Union of Ireland. Tommy's the Northern Area Organiser with them. I'd like to invite them to do a response to Holly, if that's all right, a discussion and of the others as well, but I think particularly Holly's example will be really interesting for you. So if that's all right, I'm going to add another 5 minutes on at the end there for Paul and Tommy to have a word. Okay, so I've got Holly. Holly has a presentation on the...
I've just got some photos on that.
Oh, photos.
Just got to do that sound effect.
Yes, sorry about that.
chance of money goes on and you shut us down.
That's not it.
Oh, I see.
Well,
That's not
no,
it.
I know,
Oh.
but you can't. I need to get the shutters down first so I can see the screen.
Oh, right, sorry.
Yeah, brief
Yeah.
break. Have a drink of water. Do what you want. Try and get ourselves sorted out.
Tell me when it's
Say when you can see. Can you see now? There we go. Is that going to be okay? Yeah, that's fine. Thanks. Yeah.
Dramatic.
It is. It's really dramatic. Now we'll start the creaking again.
Okay, when you're ready, I need the
Oh,
engineer.
yeah, in a minute. There you go.
Thank you. So just next, yeah.
space bar or the arrow.
Oh yeah. Whoops. Thank you. Okay. My research I did as part of my master's dissertation here at Ruskin was 2 case studies of 2 specific industrial disputes. One was my own workplace, which is a bin depot in Brighton, where I was a shop steward trade union rep, where we did a workplace sit-in to prevent pay cuts. And the other was at Sussex University, which is the main university in Brighton. And I did a comparative study looking at the respective organising methods that were used in both cases. I can assure you that our strike was extremely interesting, but for the purposes of today, I'm just going to talk about the one at Sussex Union. So in May 2012, Sussex University advertised the tender for the outsourcing of its non-academic staff, so its facilities management, so gardeners, cleaners, which would affect 235 workers across the campus. At this point, there was really low union membership density, which was fractured throughout 3 unions, UCU, Unite and UNISON, which had the majority out of the 3. There was really low sort of membership participation rates, no history of industrial struggle. The demographics of the workers were, there were a lot of migrant workers, mainly women cleaners. There's also quite a lot of young workers who were students at Sussex University who would work there part-time to fund their studies. A lot on 0 hours contracts, part-time work, so reasonably kind of precarious workers. When Sussex Union announced the privatisation, some of the affected workers started holding sort of general meetings with each other to talk about it and to talk about what they were going to do. So we started holding cross-union, so this is quotes, by the way, that I'm going to use. So the research that I did interviewed a lot of the workers that participated in this, so the quotes are from the workers themselves speaking. We started holding cross-union meetings. There was a mass meeting within a week, which was at least 250 people. Everyone started their hand up saying, right, we're going to strike over this, we're going to fight it. So those of them that were union members already agreed to go back to their respective branches and ask for this to take place, and they also set about signing up non-members. This request for strike action didn't get very far. So despite votes demanding strike action being passed in branch meetings a number of times, UNISON never started the balloting process. In one meeting we passed a vote and commit branch officials to industrial action. The next week they'd say it was impossible. So workers were getting quite frustrated at the lack of action from their unions. We had a couple more meetings and then nothing was happening, no ballot, no dispute, so people stopped coming, sort of lost interest. We'd been voting to do stuff, and then at the next meeting none of it would have been done, so people started to drift away. So workers were all sat in the pub one evening after work talking about, moaning about the unions and the situation that they found themselves in. And one of the workers said, if only we had our own. So this meeting that they had that evening started the formation of the next few months of work towards the creation of what would end up being what they called the pop-up union. So they just did. They started their own union. They began over quite a few months sort of building it up. They started having meetings. Workers from all across campus turned up. So either
a member of one of the existing unions already, but non-members as well. So anyone who wanted to fight the outsourcing and the privatisation was welcome at these meetings. This is a photo, amazing banner there, if you can remember. Communism! This was a demonstration that they had on campus, sort of opposing the privatisation, which they took to the management office. And at this demo, this is when they sort of officially launched the pop-up union. So after this happened, UNISON and UCU sent regional and national officers onto campus, whose first contribution was to start calling everyone, all these new workers in the pop-up union, scabs. Seeing as they hadn't organised a strike, I'm not sure who they were supposed to be scabbing on, and they also said that demonstrations such as this were the wrong tactic because they lost the goodwill of the management. UNISON also sent a letter to all of their members, it's quite a threatening letter, telling them that they'll be in breach of their employment contract, so they might get sacked if they take action in the pop-up. And it also sort of tells them not to join the pop-up because it undermines their bargaining power with the employer. This is despite the fact that the pop-up union were actually their biggest recruiters at this point, because they were going around campus getting everyone to sign up both to the pop-up but to UNISON and the existing unions as well, because the pop-up actively encouraged something called dual carding, which means being a member of both unions. So this is something that the IWW union sort of actively encouraged. So as well as being a card-carrying member of the WOBs, you'll also be a member of the union that exists in your own workplace as well. So this is because Pop-Up thought that all workers across campus should be in the same union so that they should fight this outsourcing together, which is a form of unionism, again one that's advocated and practiced by the IWW, which is called industrial unionism. So what that means essentially is that workers who are in one workplace, so geographically or sort of by employer, are all members of the same union, and this kind of approach is to try to counteract the sort of ridiculous situation of kind of union competition, or like the free market of trade unions, if you like, that you get. So like in schools, for example, you'd get sort of teachers who would be in the NUT and the NASUWT, the teaching assistants would be in the GMB, your caretakers, whoever, would be in UNISON. So industrial unionism means that all of those workers in that school, for example, would be in the same union, in the same branch. I'd hope that the benefits of that are obvious. So if something happens to those caretakers, for example, it means that all the school can rally behind those caretakers and strengthen numbers, etc. So anyway, sorry. So presumably, due to the pressure of the pop-up, UNISON did arrange for an indicative ballot, so not an actual ballot for industrial action, but sort of an opinion poll, if you like. That's a picture of the poster for it, which they went around campus and stuck over all the pop-up posters that were on notice boards and stuff. And this indicative ballot took the form of a 4-page survey, so not of how would you feel about going on strike, yes or no. They did a 4-page survey of how often do you want to receive emails about insurance offers from UNISON and whatever. And on page 4 of this survey said, oh, how do you feel about taking industrial action? So they did this indicative ballot, but then they never even announced the result. They lost a load of responses and then claimed that the turnout was low. They claimed they must have just been lost, but people were going around literally giving them to people, and people were filling out right in front of them, giving them back, and we counted more back than they allegedly received, so there was all sorts of dodginess. My research participants' words, not my own. So taking UNISON's place effectively the pop-up union applied to the certification officer for official accreditation as a sort of registered proper trade union. They notified the university that they were formally in trade dispute with them, and they served notice on the employer of their intention to ballot for industrial action, which they then did. That's the official pop-up ballot paper. What happened, however, was that the university threatened them with a court injunction because there were slight technicalities in their ballot. And they called the police on them on one of their meetings that was being held in a student occupation. And shortly after this, the pop-up released a statement saying that they were forced to abandon the ballot, and eventually 2 different contracts were awarded by the university to private companies and services were privatised. That's quite a sad little end to the story, I know. So this talk is supposed to be about organising in precarious times, and to me, in addition to the rise in sort of zero-hour contracts, outsourcing, and the overall neoliberal fragmentation of work, I think what we're really talking about when we talk about all that stuff is the decline in numbers and in terms of our power of the labour movement. And is it any wonder that's the case when we see unions acting in such a way as they did in this case study? So why? Why do unions act in this way? It's something that Gramsci called industrial legality. And I think that when we talk about trade unions, it's important that we understand their actual role in society and what they do, so that we can better know how to counteract it if we need to. So, unions' role in our society and under capitalism means that as they exist at the minute, they're institutions and legally recognised institutions, and anything that is an institution develops its own material interests that they're then obliged to protect. So at the moment, some of the legislation that regulates unions means that if workers take unlawful action, for example, not in accordance with the kind of official legal value procedures, they can be held liable for this and have their assets seized. So this means that union buildings, so your caravan parks in Dorset or wherever it is, and your hotels that they own in Eastbourne, and your big offices in London, the buildings and a union's assets and their staff becomes their main concern. So any sort of original aim that unions have of advancing workers' rights or workers' liberation, maybe, and any action that's taken to achieve these aims comes to be sort of watered down or even prevented, as the bureaucracy that's necessary to uphold that organisation attempts to kind of keep hold of its legitimacy and its own existence. So essentially, if they have all their money and stuff taken away and they don't own any buildings and offices and they have no offices and no staff and no war chest, what is a union at the minute like in society? As they exist at the moment, what would a union be without all its stuff? One of the key findings from my research, where I conducted lengthy interviews with the workers that were involved in the pop-up, was that material gains, so pay and terms and conditions and stuff that's traditionally seen as the bread and butter of trade unionism, was so much less important to the research participants than things like membership control and democracy as a value. And even though the pop-up union lost, they effectively lost, because the workers were eventually outsourced. Ultimately, all the participants in my research, all of them, felt so overwhelmingly positive about the whole experience because they were in control of it. They actively wanted a part in its democratic mechanisms and processes and to feel an ownership of their struggle and what happens to them at work. And I think one of the main ways that we can understand union bureaucracy is that it prevents that from happening. So, how do we make sure that it doesn't hang on by that?
About 2 minutes.
Okay. So, Michel's theory of oligarchy meaning sort of power in the hands of a few. He thinks that oligarchy comes about because direct participation by every member just isn't something that's practically possible. But I think the pop-up union shows that actually not to be the case. So this is a nice quote from one of them. A lot of people have this thing of, this is what a union should be, where anyone can bring an idea and it's discussed. You could see people coming out of their shell. I don't want to be patronising about it, but people who wouldn't normally speak at meetings will come and stick their hand up and say, oh, well, actually, I think we should do this. And people would discuss it and they'd vote. And that's what a union does. And they were like, oh, there was this sudden sense of power and realisation that this isn't like those other meetings. In the pop-up rulebook, which they all wrote collectively and voted decided on, they explicitly set out how they're going to try to counteract bureaucracy. And one of these ways, which I think is really interesting, is that the membership dues of the pop-up were 50p a month, which is lower than like United Communities or unemployed membership and stuff like that. So as well as sort of how inclusive that is and how many people that allows to join and become a part of it, it also eliminates one of the main processes of bureaucratisation that I mentioned earlier, which is that one of the reasons that a union might oppose sort of unofficial action or anything like that by its members is because it puts itself at financial risk from the courts by doing so. But in the case of the pop-up, that wouldn't and could not be the case because they literally had nothing to lose. At their peak, they had approximately 200 members. So that means that every month they'd get 100 quid, which they'd spend on sort of socials. They did language classes for the migrant workers that they were members of. This is copied and pasted from the pop-up rulebook. So decisions should be made collectively. This means that they're made by mass meetings and workers on the job, not by officials. Anyone elected to negotiate with management should have a mandate from the workforce that gives them clear guidance on what is and is not acceptable. Mass meetings of workers must be able to recall all delegates. I think this is really important. I've been on strike myself, and you have officers going to meetings to negotiate on your behalf, and they're locked in there for a week. You've got literally no idea what they're saying. They often don't report back to you. Who knows what goes on in there. So this is the membership saying, right, well, you're going to have a meeting. This is what we're willing to compromise on, if at all, maybe not. You're going to go into this meeting and say that on our behalf, and if you don't, and you say something else, or cop out, or whatever, then we'll just recall you. Like, you're crap, you're finished, someone else's go, you go instead. So it's about accountability. So they wrote these sort of rules and adopted this approach to try to ensure democracy in their organisation and try to sort of implement that, the value of that in every single thing that they did and how they operated. When I asked them why they did this, one of them said, putting all your energy into reclaiming or building branches of unions is not always possible. Slogans like, pressure the bureaucracy to call action now, is often useless in practice because union bureaucracies are perfectly capable of just ignoring members and doing what they want. I think the research that I did shows that the pop-up union did exactly the opposite, and its ability to reach out to the majority of affected workers and not ignore them, but to actively engage them in struggle was probably the most successful aspect of its existence. And many of my interviewees spoke a lot about how powerful this specific form of organising made them feel, not as an individual, but as a collective. When the injunction came in, we all walked out linking arms. There was cops everywhere and we were fucking terrified. There was riot vans parked up all round and we were all expecting to be carted off for breaking this injunction. As it turned out, hundreds of people turned up because that's what we all agreed and voted to do, and they didn't dare touch us, and I'd say that a community was created in that moment. So Manny Ness, an American academic, top fangirl, he's amazing. He's wonderful. He's my favourite. he's edited a book called Ours to Master and Ours to Own, which you should read, which is a global account of instances of workers' control. And there's a chapter in it that's written by Sheila Cohen. And she says, why do workers independently adopt this identical committee-based, delegate-led, directly democratic structure for their most powerful expressions of resistance? And I think that answers that quite well. So the pop-up union was, I think, a real attempt to put syndicalist methods of organising and radical approaches to worker democracy into practice in a modern, industrial, precarious context. And I think it shows that there's possibilities for organising like that in workplaces or with workers, that unions either don't want to organise or can organise or won't organise. And I think it'd be, to be honest, I think I'd be being disingenuous if we called it a success, because it wasn't. Its primary aim, which was to fight the privatisation of services and the outsourcing of their own jobs, failed. It wasn't achieved. But I don't think that that means that there aren't important lessons that we can learn from it as a movement, from an account of its failures and successes.
Thank you. We are running a little bit short on time, but I would like to give the floor just momentarily to Paul and Tommy in particular, just to give us a very short response, if you would, to what you've heard, and then we'll open it up for a broader discussion. Is that okay? Would you like to come round here? Is that okay?
Sure. Unfortunately, I haven't anything prepared, but
it's okay.
I'm not stopping. I found the three presentations incredibly interesting, and so much of it resonates with our own experience, particularly what you say, Holly, and that particular union you mentioned. We've had our own bitter experiences with it, but not confined to UNISON. We've had many conflicts with the established unions. One of the things that I would caution you about is being, and I don't think you're being blasé about the power of the police, but two members of our union have just recently been released from prison for taking part in the anti-water tax protest in Ireland. Both of them actually are men in their late 60s, one of them suffering from Parkinson's disease. So don't underestimate the state when it comes into conflict with the working class. It will not hold back. But I think, or is it Becky? Yeah. Your point about power, I think, is very, very important, because ultimately it's what leverage we have is what delivers. And I think we've got to also take into effect the relationship between the union movement and the state. And this is where I suspect a number of factors are coming into play at the moment, because the economy is changing. And as a result of that, we are very likely in a situation not unlike what was happening towards the end of the 19th century, where we talked about new unionism, where the unskilled manual labouring class was being brought into the trade union movement as apart from the old craft unions. We now have to re-evaluate what's happening, and this is what my union, the Independent Workers' Union, is looking at. Some of it's new in the type of organising you're talking about, Holly, which isn't new really after all, because the class struggle is still the class struggle from the dawn of history. The Wobblies come up with their ideas, and there's pertinence there, but we've got to bring it into the modern era. I think that's what our lesson has been, that we've got to look at every aspect of organising. At the end of the day, I think we've got to keep in mind that we're talking here, when we're talking of power, that ultimately we have to think in terms of state power. That it's not just trade union power, but state power, because without state power, we won't have power. The unions in Britain at the beginning of the 20th century founded the labour movement, And for that we can take a certain amount of, maybe a huge amount of blame, but seeing how Labour has turned out in spite of Corbyn's arrival. In Ireland we have had the unfortunate experience that the Labour Party, for a number of reasons, historical reasons, has aligned itself with the right wing. It's formed several coalitions with the right wing Conservative Party, but also the trade union movement in Ireland has largely supported the Labour Party. There's a very close connection between the ICTU, that's Irish Congress of Trade Unions, and the Irish Labour Party, and as such the Irish Congress of Trade Unions has apologised and supported the what is effectively the accommodation that the Labour Party in Ireland has sought with the right wing and the neoliberal agenda, the austerity programme. That's a huge problem. Now, having said all that, and for all the criticisms we have also experienced in Ireland something else that I think we've got to take on board to examine. And I do take what you've been saying about the experiences of the trade union movement, how it has moved away in terms of the global south. But I mean, there's another phrase I would use in terms of our problem there. Yes, it's the defects within the trade union movement, but we've also got to take on board that old one of imperialism. It hasn't gone away by any manner of means. We're still talking about imperialism, we're still experiencing down in the global south the detriment, and we're experiencing it in Europe as well, actually. But one of the experiences we have found is that our union, in a number of cases, has actually acted as a ginger group to force larger unions to do what they should have done in the first place. One of a notable example in my own locality, we had a lot of migrant workers from Eastern Europe finding themselves in what we call the mushroom industry, picking mushrooms, and a particularly nasty device was used to sweat their labour, and that was to pay them by the pound. And what we would say was that we pay them a couple of pence per pound, and if they collected X number of pound per hour, they could make the minimum wage, which theoretically they would have had to have 6 hands and 2 heads to do it. We know how you sweat labour. But what we did by organising among the mushroom workers, we forced the biggest union in Ireland, SIPTU, to come along and start to organise. A little bit of the way, as you say, UNISON did, arrived on the scene late. On this occasion, SIPTU at least had the muscle to insist on the mushroom workers getting the minimum wage, which, not great, but was an advantage. But what we have also found is that by working with some of the larger unions, the better elements of it, the more radical elements of it, we've been able to see the development of what we call the right to water, which is a big campaign in the Republic of Ireland to keep water charges out of, to prevent the taxation of water. We had a free, not free, but we wouldn't be charged a tax to pay monthly for water charges. The union movement, some of the bigger unions were dragged into it and forced that along. We were able to mobilise huge numbers on the streets. The Irish Trade Union movement, now against the opposition of SIPTU, which is the biggest union, better opposition from SIPTU and some of the other right-wing unions, but Unite the Union played a leading part in it. Mandate, which is the shop workers union, the two big unions that took part in it, organised well over 100,000. Now, keep in mind the Republic of Ireland has a population of about 4 million, so you put 110,000 onto the streets of Dublin. That's a big protest, and that then went over into the right to water change, which was actually, well, it was a social democratic rather than a socialist programme, but it engaged the trade union movement on a bigger issue. So I think we've got to look at a number of issues here when we're talking about this situation. There's a transformation of the economy which we've got to look at, as I say, similar analogous to the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, accommodate ourselves to that. We've got to reorganise, as you say, and smaller unions. We don't call ourselves a pop-up union because we are established. I'm not going to go into the whole history of our foundation, but although relatively new, we've had a long history and we have contacts within the wider trade union movement and some of the left-wing, we call them TDs, but they're MPs in the Irish Republic. Some of the left-wing TDs would support us, so we have got a certain grip on the situation that your pop-up union wouldn't have. And as such, it has given us such a traction that you wouldn't have, perhaps. But it's not to dismiss what you've done, because that's exactly what has to be done, I would suggest. So I think that there's this huge amount of work to be done, but if we cannot allow the old trade union structures, and with its relationship with capital, its relationship with the state to remain intact. What happened in Ireland, and I'm going to finish on this, about 25 years ago, we end up in cyclical crisis in Ireland because of the nature of the society and the economy. Every 20 years there's a cyclical crisis. We don't need Lehman Brothers in Ireland to have cyclical crises. They can come anyway. But 20 years ago, 25 years ago, in the midst of one of these crises, the union movement, the state and the employers met around a table to set up what they call social partnership. So we had organised labour, the state and capital sitting around the table, working out pay agreements, tax agreements, effectively a corporate agreement, corporatism. And that is what the Irish trade union movement, because after the crash of 2008-2010, capital simply took the loss. They didn't need the money longer. What the Irish trade union movement, the leadership of the trade union movement, is hoping to get back to that corporatist state. And that's one of the areas that we've got to prevent happening. And the radical unionism is one of the ways to do it. As long as we keep in mind that it's state power that we're looking for, not just a deal with capital.
Thank you. I think we're really lucky to have Tommy with us actually today. The last minute edition, well worth it. So thanks very much for that. We've got about 20 minutes now for some questions, comments, and discussion. So just feel free, whatever you'd like to do, whether you'd like to ask a specific question, whether you'd like to bring your own. Okay, John first.
I have a question for Holly. You mentioned the pop of getting official accreditation, which I think costs quite a bit of cash. And you also mentioned them not having much cash, so I'm just wondering how I went about that process.
Yeah, quite interestingly, they outsourced it. So they didn't, like I already explained, the reasons why they didn't want to have the kind of big war chest of money. So they crowdsourced it. They went to other trade union branches, amongst students at universities, other people. They crowdsourced the money to do that. There's another union called the IWGB, a campaign, I wish I had more time to talk about in my talk actually, because they're amazing. Had a campaign a couple of years ago, the Three Cossas campaign, organising cleaners in London, and they did the same thing. So when they went on strike over sick pay, holiday pay and pensions, they crowdsourced their strike funds and managed to pay all their members for the duration of their industrial action. So that's how they did it. Can I take this opportunity to make a very quick little plug? I was going to make a nice slide about this, but I don't know the Ruskin Wi-Fi password, so it's literally just a crappy link. So I was going to put a cool picture to make you all want to do it, but I was finished. Oh, I didn't. Hang on. I didn't put it on my USB. It's just on my own. Right. Anyway, there's a union called the United Voices of the World who are currently organising outsourced workers at Topshop. They're amazing. They're brilliant. They've just been issued with a court injunction which bans them from protesting and demonstrating within, is it 10 metres? Yeah, some arbitrary thing of the contractors that they've got their dispute with. And they've also just been issued with a fine of £11,000 as a result of this court case that they've been going through. If anyone wants to contribute to their crowdsourcing, of which they're trying to pay that fund, hang on. Sorry, I should have prepared this earlier.
That's all right.
It's on Twitter.
What do you do?
It's on Twitter. You can find
It's on Twitter.
You can't just
It's
go on
fine.
Twitter. What does that?
You can contribute that.
What we'll
It's
do is,
easy.
whilst you're
If I
doing
can
that,
do it,
take another question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Give
Right,
the cash
so
in then.
you do that, and I'll take another question. Thank you. So Colin, and then there's somebody in the back there, and then.
Yeah, Colin Rose from Tutor here at Ruskin. thought the contributions were really interesting and really enjoyed Tommy's contribution as well. I'm wondering though if sometimes we're falling into this idea of there's the corrupt trade unions and they're bureaucratised and they're bought into capitalism, and therefore we've got to set up these new pure sort of trade unions that are democratic and member run. Because this has been tried, you know, sort of over the last 150 years. I mean, there's a long tradition, as Tommy would know, you know, syndicalism in Ireland, of people absolutely rightly and understandably breaking away from the big unions who are not representing them. But unfortunately, sometimes the same things reproduce themselves. You know, I'm thinking about there's a union, National Bus and Rail Workers Union, which broke away from SIPTU in Ireland, and yet in a whole series of struggles and battles over the last 10 or 20 years, the officials in that union have played a role of restraining action, disciplining militants, and all that sort of stuff. And I think it's a bigger question that we have to ask ourselves about the relationships of trade unions to capitalism. And I don't know. I just think that we have to, instead of seeing it, I think, just in sort of one-dimensional terms, I think we have to see that there's a battle for the heart and the direction of trade unions everywhere. And whatever way that plays out, whether it's breaking away or whether it's fighting in the trade union, there's a battle there. And I think we can see that played out in Ireland at the moment. So 5 major unions got involved in the anti-water charges movement, and it made a big difference. You know, as Tommy would know, it made a big difference in terms of projecting that movement more widely, and so on. There's also an argument still going on within the unions who didn't go with that. You know, don't sit to make an argument that they should break with the Labour Party and so on. So there is a struggle and a battle. And it seems to me, I think that, you know, I think more and more that there's a question of premium on the question of politics, class politics, in the working class movement more generally. Because I think that if you leave it, you know, at that social democratic level of sort of trade unions trying to find their position within capitalism to negotiate the best deal for the working class, what we need to fight for is a vision of going beyond capitalism. How can we overthrow it? How can the working class take power? Because I think that's the thing that's being raised by so many struggles. And just the final thing that I want to say is that I think, I read a book that did a survey of radical trade unionism in Europe over the last few years, which looked at, you know, it's great stories of great experience and very valuable, and looked at the experience of the Independent Workers' Union in Ireland, similar unions in Greece and all that sort of stuff. However, when it comes to the big battles that are going on in Greece at the moment, or France at the moment, just in the last couple of weeks, I don't know that it's going to just come from radical breakaway trade unions. Surely it is a battle, and it's a battle we can possibly win, to convince the existing trade unions where workers are, not the bureaucrats, but convince workers to go into action. There's strike, and that's a political process. So there's the appointment and the betrayal of the Syriza government the last year is playing out, you know, and there's a big question there. Are the workers going to continue to struggle against privatisation and austerity? And at the moment, the dock workers in Piraeus, one of the most important docks in Europe, so much of the trade that China comes through there, are talking about striking in spite of what Syriza has done, you know, using their collective power and action to do it. Whether they're a member of the old corrupt trade unions is not the important thing. They are members of those old corrupt unions. What's important is their action and the political action that goes beyond that compromising and that betrayal.
Thank you, John. I've got 3 more contributions. There's a gentleman. No, you're okay. So we've got. I'm sorry, I don't know your names, but this is Sally. Adeline, yeah. And then Ian as well, and who's next to me. Okay, brilliant.
When Becca was speaking about how to better disrupt things like that, I think Holly came up with a perfect solution there. Some kind of pop-up action, but obviously that needs to be sorted out. And even things like flash mobs and things like that, because you want to do things in a peaceful way. But if you can kind of utilise the social media and things like that, maybe people don't know about your cause all that much. And if you kind of push it out to social media and then start all this like social activism, then that's probably a really good way to I don't know, have like a second wave of, I don't know.
Thank you. Adeline.
Yeah, Holly, I thought that was a very inspiring story from the pop-up union. It somehow reminds me of just like Arab Spring, you know, people came together spontaneously to try and overthrow the government they dislike. And I think it's sad to know that our union, we've got so many unions in this country, and they are not able to help the people they represent. I don't know what future there is. Are you hopeful about this pop-up union will continue to succeed and getting stronger? And it will just fizzle out like maybe Arab Spring, that kind of movement?
Yes. I think the Arab Spring is possibly a bit of a dramatic comparison, but the pop-up union doesn't actually exist anymore. It folded. Once it was set up, it was never set up to kind of always exist and be a new union. It was created specifically to fight that campaign because the unions wouldn't. Long term, I think what it did was kind of sow the seeds, if you like. I hate using that phrase, but you know what I mean. Like, it engaged a lot of workers in struggle for the first time. And I think the lessons that it kind of taught the people who are involved in it, whether it's at that workplace or in other ones that they go to, that's how they would be looking to organise again. So they wouldn't be satisfied with kind of stoic union branches. I mean, there is a kind of, is resurgence a bit grand? Yeah, I think there's a resurgence of kind of new unions, if you like, which, you know, what was Tommy, as Tommy said, like, this isn't a new method of organising. It's, you know, it's a method that's been around for, you know, for 150 years. But I think it's kind of having, I suppose you could see it as a kind of comparison, like it mirrors neoliberalism, if you like. So as work becomes more fractured, unions are becoming more fractured. I think it's interesting that a lot of, so the United Voices of the World, for example, the IWGP union in London, the kind of workers that they're organising aren't your kind of local authority workers who have been sort of safe. They're all organising in precarious workplaces, and they're doing it in places where it needs to be done. And I see a lot of hope in that, and I'm glad that they are, because I think as a movement, the traditional unions are so way behind on that. Because, oh, it's too difficult, so, well, it's not.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just going to, Becca's got something she wants to come back on
Sorry.
as well.
Really quickly, yeah. Just to make clear, Citizens UK very much does use flash mobs, spontaneous dance, or you know, creative things that make use of social media, all those kind of things. A lot probably of an actually wider toolbox than the trade unions would be used to. So my question was more about if, and often it works the first time. You ask for something nicely in a eye-catching, media-friendly way, and then you get it. But my question was more about what happens if you don't get it, and then without any kind of industrial muscle or organising built in a way that can disrupt the flow of capital in the workplace, maybe then what next? And I guess the message is that the power that you need to have is proportionate to what you're asking for. So if you're asking for something that's quite easy for the powers that be to grant, then you can just push easily and it happens and you go home. But if you're asking for something much bigger and transformational, we need a lot more organising right across the board.
Thank you. I've got a couple more in.
Yeah. Just, I don't know where to start with. My head's popping with all sorts of questions. No. Just, first of all, well done for organising the event and the panel, because I think just on clearly your point about women and organised labour, without wanting to sound passionate on it at all, I think it's really important that the panel is comprised of all women, because it speaks to the need to look at workers' power and how workers are organised from, as you said, vastly different perspectives.
I suppose I've just got a technical point really, which is kind of linked to Holly's point, but I don't want to exclude other colleagues from contributing, which is, it's a technical point really, but I want to link it with what a lot's been said. A lot of my work still is with UNISON in particular, and preparing UNISON branches before outsourcing and privatisation for the maintenance of union organisation post outsourcing, post privatisation as well. And the regulations, won't bore you with the detail, changed quite significantly beginning in 2014, and absolutely clinically identifies clear ways to undermine union organisation. Very clearly, even to the extent that if you're a worker who's belonged to a union for the first time, you're at a specific detriment in terms of your terms and conditions of employment. And I think the main thing that came out of your research for me, as you was working through it, and just now is kind of crystallised, is that the whole point about workers' power, Becca, that you talked about, too, that you talked about in how it's formulated, is kind of, your research talks about what the experience of struggle does for people, doesn't it? That workers can realise their own power, and although, too, as you said, you can't detract from what unions have done historically, at the moment, when I work with union branches, lots of workers just don't know what's happening to them. They know that the job's going to be outsourced, and yeah, as you said, their officials are locked away in meetings. I think what your research talks about is that although technically workers can lose, you never lose from the experience of struggle, do you, Tom, which is your point, wasn't it? You never lose from understanding through struggle that the police are part of the state. They're not independent in any way. And what I take a lot from your research and from what other colleagues have said is that workers need to be exposed in those kind of situations to, if it's possible, I know it's more easily said than done, an exposure to the political economy of what's happening to them. At the moment in the situation that you're talking about, it's simply you're moving from one employer to another. But we need to understand why the public sector's under attack, don't we? And that your jobs are being seen as, theoretically, ideologically, better protected in the private sector than the public sector. So I think the thing for me that the trade unions do, and it came up quite strongly, is they have had a historical role. I think they've still got a very important role. But one of the things that they do, as a byproduct of being represented, is they diminish the capacity of workers to be exposed to, a kind of cold-face way, the realities of what's happening to work as well. So I think fantastic research, of course, applies. But I think it tells us a lot about what workers can still learn about what's happening to them.
Thank you very much. We've just got 5 minutes. There was, I'm really sorry.
Yeah, it's Elizabeth.
Elizabeth, please,
Yeah.
and then Paul, the final point if I may.
Okay, thank you very much for all the perspectives. They were just really important for me to hear, especially the looking at the dimension of women and we're just looking at what happens in the global south and how we organise. To do our my last submission here, which was about examination of the ILO's notion of decent work. I read a couple of things around, the ideal sweatshop, which is Brooks and Eisenstein's Sweatshop Feminists, and they really did spend some time looking at, just precisely what you talked about, and I was just very struck with that whole intersectionality of it being black women and who are, to me, most affected by this whole argument, and to me that is the reason that this continues to be undermined, this whole process. I really feel deep racism is at the heart of it, and that's just my opinion on the examination of the material. It hasn't got enough people interested in that conversation to move it forward. There's no will and there's no way. And that's not being depressed about it. I think that's what stops it going forward, and that's why we need so much that individual voice that women do. That happens when people come together and make their arguments themselves. They're not bound by that. I can't tell you what it needs to hear, that research that's just come out there, that I feel sick to my stomach.
I'm an NEC member of UNISON, and I feel ashamed, actually, you know, and actually quite upset, you know, to hear those things, because, and I thought about not contributing because, you know, there are people in this room who will know that I've got that position. I think it's really important to point out where we do this sort of bashing of, you know, they've all tied into capitalism and it's all the leadership that's the fault. But some of the lay members who go into being leaders of the union don't go in there to be part of what you just presented. They actually go part of a process that they seriously believe in. I know why. I know why I took on my post. I know why I campaigned and why members vote for me overwhelmingly to be their voice. And you are stuck in, and it was about the second term, I'm in my third term now, so 6 years being re-elected. And then my second term is when I realised how unions, trade unions as a whole, and my colleagues will know because I talk about it, you know, sort of how we become so, it's almost as if we just need to sustain ourselves as an organisation, just like a shop front, Marks and Spencer's or something. It's like everybody's trying to keep people in jobs and all of these push for, you know, what's happening with their pensions and can we close down this office there, and it starts to be about that. I mean, I had this naive idea that I'd be able to come to an NEC member and put black members' issues firmly on that agenda. That's my elected role. Yeah, get all those things fought through. You can't even contribute to that agenda. It's a business meeting about running a business. And it starts to be like that. And all the arguments you thought you would bring forward as an activist, you know, the very process suppresses that coming through. And so I end up sort of saying to people, have your arguments down there. Don't expect the NEC to go forward. You need to keep doing this fight and this believe this way we structure ourselves that said, well, it will be the people at the top who will make it all happen. Actually, no, that's what I found out 2 terms in. You know, you need to do it, you need to be that voice, and that's when it shifts. The pressure does shift, and we do respond to that. And that's happened repeatedly. So I think I'm giving a bit of a sad one, but also saying there is hope in the power of the people, and it comes back to precisely what you said about, you know, this collectivism, that voice of it changing things. But my summary thing to say, I'm sorry, I know you want me to be short, but it's about why it's as if, I feel like it's when it was the slave trade, and lots of information came out about how appalling it was, but really the people didn't get to know. There's like this small collection of people who know about it and are appalled by it, but it's not enough. And I feel that the information doesn't get out in the way it needs to, and I think your research is so vitally important. And I bet that there are, I mean, I don't know how many people on our NEC would even know about how that developed. I certainly have no knowledge of that dispute, and it happened within my term because I just checked the years. So I think there's something very important about that. It's where does the information go? How do we get it out there with the people who will do some activity around it? And I have to come back to the colleague from Ireland who said something. Really, I think there is something about, even if you do get some of this voice, it goes back into, it will form its own self to become the same thing in the end with part of that bureaucracy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry.
No, it's a brilliant contribution. Thanks very much indeed. We just have, well, we've gone a little bit over time, but I'd like to invite Paul to
just, I mean,
really.
after the contribution, Elizabeth, I don't know what to say, but well, just a general point, I suppose, that a lot of the struggles we see at the minute, it seems to me anyway, that they're part of, and the small, I mean, actually they're about, the big things they're actually about, when you look at it, seemingly very little incidents. If you look at the issue, I mean, the question of France, it's all they wanted, you know, CGT just simply wants to push back some labour law, you know, and suddenly you've got this massive social conflagration because the government's introducing what in this country other neoliberal states would be taken for granted. I suppose what I'm saying is, to cut it short, there's so much changing, and the social settlement between the labour movement and capital in Europe has been transformed, and traditional unions want to get back to the way it used to be, as Tommy was saying about partnership in the Republic of Ireland. They just want to go back. Let's go back to before 2008. Let's get back to pretend it's, you know, we didn't have these issues. Just sit down and talk to capital. It's not possible anymore to do it in the old way because of the way the sociology of the working class has changed and society more broadly. Political economies don't allow that. And so unions, even traditional unions raising little issues, become a contact point really, a lightning rod for broader social concerns. And then broader social concerns around things like the water charge in the Republic of Ireland, which in a lot of countries 20 years ago wouldn't have been an issue because most people in good jobs could afford to pay it. It wouldn't be an issue now because of the attack on wages, because of austerity. It mobilises people, and trade unions are caught behind that. It's like there's this arc of rising discontent, rising social despair, and unions have to try to get in, and they want to go back to the way it used to be, and it's not going back to the way it used to be. So some of the issues which small pop-up unions raise, which independent unions like the IWU or the SUD unions in France, which were often ignored, suddenly the ideas become part of the general, basis for mobilisation, and it's just despite bureaucratisation, Michelle's, I think we shouldn't be too pessimistic. I think capital has as many problems as us. Hopefully.
Thank you. Yeah, that's actually brilliant. Thank you all for your contributions. I'm sorry to run out of time because I think there's a lot more that could be said, but I'd particularly like to thank the panel members, Becca, Thulsi and Holly. And if anybody would like to continue the conversation, and I'm sure they'd be more than glad to have a chat afterwards. But thanks very much to everybody for coming, and see you at the next one.
Before he goes off for lunch, I just think we should say a huge thank you to Fenella as well. It was Fenella that put me on the hard work. Not only putting in the work to the bid to Lipman-Miliband to get the money from them successfully this time, brilliantly, but also the first of the organising these series of events. So there will be more. So
I'll get better at it as well.
Thank you very much. Oh yeah, and on the 18th of June, sorry, really quickly, 18th of June we have a political school. Yeah, do you want one?
Yeah, so we've got a one-day political school at Ruskin, sort of re-establishing that tradition of trying to have those radical debates, so within the movement. And we've got a combination of people who are sort of founded the movement. John McDonnell will be here, we're delighted to have him, and Matt Rack and a couple of people like that from the machine. But we've also had a load of activists as well from the nurses campaign, junior doctors, grassroots women's campaign, and so on. All part of the debating issues like labour movements attitude to the EU, how do we organise sort of the union movement today, and those sorts of things. And we're delighted if you would come along to it and be part of that.
18th of June.
It's on our website.
Yeah, free to attend.
Yeah.
Right. Anybody who's hoping to attend the focus group discussion, we'll be back in here at 2 o'clock.
Sorry.
Yeah, there's people around you who are going to be there this afternoon, so we should.
No, sorry, I sorry,
like I said, she's like,
oh, sure.
Yeah, but it's just
well, I know that. I just think it's